Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Coast to Coast Hockey. Today, we'll be discussing everything to do with the Winnipeg Jets. My name's Cameron.
I'm Noel.
And I'm Nick.
Let's get into it.
The main additions that the Jets made this offseason was from the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. They brought in Gabe Vilardi, Alex Iafallo, and Rasmus Kapai from that deal. They also brought in goaltenders Laurent Brossoit and Colin Delia.
Now, as Noah mentioned, the key subtraction for the Winnipeg Jets was Pierre-Luc Dubois. He's off to LA. And the Jets also lose their former captain, Blake Wheeler, who's now in New York. Among other subtractions include some depth pieces as well as David Rittich. Now, one of the biggest arrivals for the Jets is Gabriel Vilardi. During what we can consider a retool for the Jets as they are confused and trying to figure out who they're going to trade and who they're going to keep, Gabriel Vilardi is a great piece to take a chance on. This is a guy who has battled a ton of injuries throughout his junior and professional career, especially being in his draft year where he only played 32 games. Despite that, he went 11th overall despite potentially being a top 5 talent of that 2017 NHL entry draft. But now he's in the NHL, and in his first majority full season with LA, he put up 41 points in 63 games, which I consider a great stepping stone towards a breakout season next year. I hope he plays 82 games next year, and I really hope he stays healthy, but it'll be something to look forward to or look out for as Winnipeg Jets fans.
The next big addition is another forward coming over from the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. It's going to be Alex Iafallo. This is a player who had somewhat of a breakout season last year. He put up 36 points in 59 games compared to 37 in 79 the season before. That's an improvement from a 38-point pace to a 50-point pace. He's also a responsible defensive player who kills penalties and plays well defensively at even strength. I think his contract's a fair deal, and I think he's a pretty underrated player in the league right now.
And finally, welcome back Laurent Brossoit. This is his second stint with the Winnipeg Jets, and he played pretty unreal last year. He posted a 9.27 and a save percentage and a 2.17 goals against through 11 games. And he did play solid in the playoffs as well for Vegas before Aiden Hill took over, and we all know how that ended. A bit of an interesting tidbit for Laurent Brossoit. He's had a pretty mixed bag of seasons for the past 5 years. He's been kind of flip-flopping between pretty elite numbers like we saw last year and then pretty subpar numbers. So we'll see if which version of Laurent Brossoit the Winnipeg Jets get this year. And he's going to be a backup behind, one of the best goalies in the league, Connor Hellebuyck. So he shouldn't have too big of a workload.
Moving on from the rivals to our future outlook, the big prospect there is the one they just took in the most recent draft, Colby Barlow, and then Rutger McGrody, Chaz Lucius, Brad Lambert, and Ville Heinola. Nick's going to get into some more of those guys in a second for you.
And you guys can see the draft capital on the board there. They have a lot of their own picks, but we're going to see which direction the Jets really choose to go here because they can move out a lot of these to be buyers at the deadline or even acquire a lot more picks if they decide to trade Scheifele and Hellebuyck. But we'll get more on that later too.
Now on to the prospect spotlight for the Winnipeg Jets. The 3 prospects that we're highlighting today are Colby Barlow, Rutger McGrody, and Brad Lambert. First off, with Colby Barlow, this is a guy that people were questioning his skating in the draft, yet he put up 46 goals in 59 games. This is very hard to do in the OHL, which is considered by many to be one of the best development leagues in the world for that age group. So I can see Colby Barlow being a shoot-first mentality player in the NHL as well, if he continues this confidence. I really look forward to seeing him on the wing. He does not have the feet to be a centerman in the NHL at this point, but it'd be nice to see if he can provide some offense on the wing to some of their centers, potentially being Gabe Vilardi's line mate in the future of Winnipeg. Now, another prospect of mention is Rutger McGrody. This is a guy who had a fantastic freshman year in Michigan. He put up a point a game, 39 points in 39 games. Meanwhile, this is a team that had Adam Fantilli, Luke Hughes, Gavin Brindley, among other talented players, but he held his own as a freshman at 18 years old. And this is a guy who underwhelmed in his draft year in other leagues, but has a very translatable skill set where he's a very hard worker and he proves himself every day. So that this is a guy that I could see making the NHL and being a sticker in the NHL for a long time. The third prospect of mention is Brad Lambert. This is the dual citizen Finnish-Canadian who has played with Finland at many national championships and was once touted to be such a top pick in the 2022 draft a few years ago. He since fell to 30th overall because of some production issues in the men's league and Liga, but he turned all heads around when he went to the WHL for 1 year, played with Seattle Thunderbirds, one of the best teams in the WHL, and put up way over a point per game. This is a guy that I can see being a high-skilled dynamo player for the Winnipeg Jets that somebody should have taken a flyer on in the draft, but they chose not to, and he falls to the Winnipeg Jets at 30, luckily.
Moving on from our prospect spotlight to the projected lineup for the Winnipeg Jets. It all starts with that first line there. Obviously, the superstar in Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, who had a breakout season last year, Nikolai Ehlers, who's hoping to bounce back after a bit of a abnormal season for him last year where he didn't produce very well. And then Cole Perfetti, Gabe Vilardi, and Alex Iafallo on that second line. It's a really good second line. Really think Gabe Vilardi will be able to take that opportunity and run with it after he broke out last year. And then a good third line of Nino Niederreiter, Adam Lowry, and Vladislav Nemestikov. Got some grit there with Nino Niederreiter and Adam Lowry, some guys who play physical, and then a bit more skill there with Nemestikov. And then on the fourth line, we have one of the toughest guys in the NHL, Morgan Barron, who played through 75 stitches last season. So great guy to have on your team there. Rasmus Kupari, who to me is comparable to a David Kampf, and he's developing into a really good defensive centerman for me. And then Mason Appleton, who I believe was selected in the expansion draft with Seattle and traded back to them. So some interesting guys there on the fourth line. And then some extras that aren't totally of note there.
Yeah, one thing to note, Cameron, Adam Lowry was just named captain of the Jets, so he's been
yes.
there for a while. Hopefully
Yep.
he has a great season, his first season as captain.
Good choice for captain, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And now on to the defense. We've got Josh Morrissey, the talented offensive defenseman, alongside the talented defensive defenseman Dylan DeMello. This is a great pair to be on your top pair for any team in the league, and Winnipeg is happy to have these two. From there, you've got Brendan Dillon alongside Neil Pionk. Neil Pionk being sort of the former quarterback for the Winnipeg Jets on defense before Morrissey took over. And then you've got youngster Dylan Sandberg, who's not so young anymore, but he used to be such a touted prospect for the team, alongside Nate Schmidt. And we wonder where this guy's career has gone. Well, he's still in Winnipeg right now, making a decent buck. So we'll see how he does this year, being in sheltered minutes with the Winnipeg Jets.
And finally, looking at the goalies, you have an absolute stud in Connor Hellebuyck starting. He's a workhorse. He'll play a lot of the games, and there have been some trade rumors about him around surrounding him, but we'll touch on that in a second. Laurent Brossoit was also mentioned earlier. He's a really solid backup option for this team. Can absolutely steal some games, and we saw some of the numbers that he posted last year. So he's a pretty good backup in this league. Then finally, some depth. Colin D'Elia, he was also brought in for the offseason.
Moving on from the lineups to our 2023-24 storylines. As Noel mentioned, it all begins with the trade rumors. So the biggest one here is the Connor Hellebuyck trade rumors. Hellebuyck has the potential to be the best goalie traded since Roberto Luongo was traded from Vancouver to Florida a number of years ago. So it's pretty significant, possibly league-altering move that we're talking about. Obviously, the acquiring team has to bear the risk of he's on 1 year contract at 6.17, 30 years old. So he's going to want a massive pay raise to $9 or $10 million and probably some term too. So it's going to be tough for a team to unload that amount of cap on him. But we're talking about one of the elite goalies in the NHL who has a career save percentage of .916, 2.49 goals against average, and regularly plays over 60 games a season, as Noel mentioned. So what are some possible destinations you guys can think of when it comes to Connor Hellebuyck?
A team that I think of that, I mean, is obviously really elite right now, but maybe lacking something in net is the New Jersey Devils. Kier Schmid and Vitek Vanacek are solid options in net, but for a team that's truly trying to contend in their window right now, like the window for the Devils just opened, going out and acquiring Connor Hellebuyck could really push this team over the edge. Like we saw some inconsistencies in net last year in the playoffs for this team. Kier Schmid came in after Vitek Vanacek was struggling and did a nice job, but he didn't do a great job and couldn't get them past Carolina. So maybe going after an absolutely elite goalie like Connor Hellebuyck could really push this team over the edge and make them a dynasty for many years.
Yeah, I mean they were hoping Mackenzie Blackwood would work out, and then they ended up having to
Yep.
sort of trade him off to San Jose for a sixth rounder, which is unfortunate. So that will leave a little bit of space for them to maybe make a move like Connor Hellebuyck at the deadline. I'd argue as well. Another team I think could be in the market for this would be the Los Angeles Kings. The Los Angeles Kings' current tandem is Phoenix Copley and Cam Talbot. So this is something that I could see Connor Hellebuyck just sliding in there right away as the number one, taking over and carrying this team if they need it to the playoffs.
We already saw
Both.
a trade between these two teams with Pierre-Luc Dubois.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe there's some ties there. It's also
Exactly.
whether they trade him at the deadline or he's just let him walk. Like, I don't know what the plan is here for the Jets.
Yep. Both great teams. Another team I think he's been pretty heavily linked to is the Buffalo Sabres. This is a team that has three unproven goaltenders in net right now, with Devin Levi, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, and Eric Comrie, the former Winnipeg Jet. So at the end of the day, I think they're going to get into the season and see what they have with Devin Levi. I think there's some pretty high hopes for him, but if he kind of flounders to start out the season, they might be a team looking to improve in the crease. One other team just of note is also the Detroit Red Wings have been mentioned in these trade rumors as well. Moving on from Connor Hellebuyck to another star trade rumor, we have Mark Scheifele. So Mark Scheifele is a purely offensive center. A lot of people, I think, thought he was going to be the next captain of the Winnipeg Jets before that was given to Adam Lowry. So that maybe is the writing on the wall for him. Maybe it's showing that they're going to be looking to move him later on in the season. So he developed more as a goal scorer last year. He had a career high of 42 goals and 68 points last season in 81 games. So anybody who scores over 40 goals in the NHL is going to be worth absolute haul. He's got 1 year, just like Hellebuyck, remaining 6.125. So he's another guy who's going to be looking for a raise, probably to around that $8.5 million range, comparable to Bo Horvat. So in terms of teams for him, what do you guys think of?
When thinking about teams that need a first line center, one team that I always think about is the Minnesota Wild. They really need someone to play with Kirill Kaprizov up front. I think they got Ryan Hartman or Joel Eriksson Ek. Like Joel Eriksson Ek's a good player, but he's more of a defensive shutdown role rather than like a really offensive driven first line center. And that's really what Mark Scheifele is. He doesn't do much on defense, but he can score and he can produce. And I guess with Minnesota as well, they have a pretty strong defensive core and goalie tandem. So they could maybe make up for some of Mark Scheifele's, defensive deficiencies.
Mm-hmm.
It's just whether they can fit the cap for this trade or even sign him in the offseason. So that's one team that I'll throw out there, Minnesota Wild.
Yeah, I agree. The opportunity cost is huge here to get, especially for such a talent at 6 million ish. Even if you can retain a bit of that with a third team, this is one of the perfect examples maybe for next deadline that could go to one of those teams like the Wild that are going to be contending. I'd also like to throw in the Boston Bruins with the departure of Bergeron and Krejci this past year. We've seen their center core pretty much depleted entirely. You've got Pavel Zacha, Charlie Coyle, and Morgan Geekie as your top nine centermen. You've got some great wingers there in Marchand, Pasternak. You got Van Riemsdyk and DeBrusk as well. But someone like Mark Scheifele could push all those guys down into easier minutes and play alongside the Pasternaks, the Marchands. And I could see Scheifele doing very well because he is such a shooter first, as you've seen in his statistics. He used to be more of a playmaker, but I think he's kind of given up on that fact and wants to prove his own value, as you saw last year being minus 16 and 42 goals, and the previous year being minus 17. But in past years, he's been plus 20 with a bunch of assists. It's a complete flip flop for a career, which is kind of interesting what his mindset is going to the year as a player. But hopefully he becomes more of a team player when he gets to a team like Boston that really wants to win, because I'm sure he's sick and tired of being with the Winnipeg Jets at this point.
Yeah. Another team for me, I think those are both teams that desperately need a first line center. Another team for me that needs a top six center is the Seattle Kraken. I think if you're able to slot Scheifele in there on the second line beneath Matty Beniers, replacing Alex Wenberg, I think that would be a massive upgrade for that team. And the Kraken are a team that, as you guys will find out later on in the series, I'm not as high on as some other people are. So I think they do need to make a move to add some offense, and I think Mark Scheifele would completely address that issue for them. Some other teams just in passing that are looking to add some offense and some goals are the Carolina Hurricanes and the New York Islanders. So those would also be some teams to keep on the radar.
One thing to note is I think the fate of these players really depends on how Winnipeg starts the season. Like, are they going to
Yeah.
be buyers at the deadline or are they going to be sellers at the deadline? Because if they get off to a really hot start and are doing well and looking like they're going to make the playoffs, I can see them going all in around this core and trying to put some pieces around Connor Hellebuyck and Mark Scheifele. And then subsequently, I don't think they're going to go far, lose in the first round, and then these guys are just going to walk. So it's a really tough position to be in whether or not to trade these guys because they could get an absolute haul, and whether they want to go through a rebuild, retool, whatever you want to call it. If they trade these guys, they're going to get a haul regardless. So it just depends how they start the season, how they're doing down the line, and what they decide to do.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe when they traded Pierre-Luc Dubois, the fact that they weren't able to offload someone like Scheifele or Hellebuyck sort of is unfortunate for them. They probably regret that at that time because Dubois sort of signals to me that this team doesn't want to go for it. If you have Dubois and Scheifele as your top two centers, you're golden going into the playoffs, no matter really the decor, and Scott Hellebuyck, of course. But the fact that they were only able to offload Pierre-Luc Dubois, who was expiring contract at that point before they did the sign and trade, I believe. So it's an interesting scenario to keep these guys still into their 30s and then also being pending free agents.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear from the return in the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade, they still see themselves as at least a playoff contender. And I think what you just explained, Noel, is probably the scariest scenario for Winnipeg Jets fans. It's
Mm-hmm.
they go all in with this core that's clearly not good enough to win a Stanley Cup at this point, and then lose everybody in the offseason. That would just be super detrimental and set this franchise back a number of years. So I think possibly the best outcome would be if they get off to a tough start in the long run. So even though it might be tough now, it might be better in the long run if they don't have as successful as a season as I think Kevin Cheveldayoff thinks they're going to have. Moving on to our final storyline here, you can see it there. Josh Norrisy. Josh Morrissey was in Norris conversation last season, which kind of came out of nowhere. He exploded for 16 goals and 76 points in 78 games. That's was tied for the second most by a defenseman last season, and it's way above any of his other career highs. So, do you guys think this is sustainable for Josh Morrissey?
Just looking at his previous years, it really did come out of nowhere. I mean, he's been a solid defenseman all his life, but where did this offensive production come from? And I know fantasy owners are really happy to have Norrisy on their team. I called him Norrisy there. His name's Morrissey. Some people were even picking him up off the waiver wire. That's how little this guy had produced
I
offensively
wish.
before. So I really don't see it sustained. Like maybe he'll be better than his last
Yeah,
years, but there's going to be some regression.
Yeah. Like I briefly mentioned on the defensive lineups page, when Neil Pionk was taking the reins at the power play quarterback, that was when Neil Pionk had the best offensive seasons of his career, basically. And now you've got Morrissey taking over, and he's had the best offensive season. So it really comes down to that. I believe to that Winnipeg Jets power play as well as
hmm
the opportunity to play the first line minutes with the first line offense, which now without Pierre-Luc Dubois, your first line is with Scheifele, and your second line is without the likes of Connor and Ehlers. So it's really interesting to see the defensive shift there. Morrissey is also sort of a defenseman who's not liked by old school people. He's seen as sort of a soft, sort of delicate defenseman. But now in the modern game, he is a perfect defenseman as your number one. He is an agile, quick playmaking, pass first defenseman with a bit of defensive issues, but those are you can work that around when you have players like Dylan DeMello to back him up, basically.
I also think on that power play, subtraction that doesn't probably get brought up enough is Blake Wheeler because this is a guy who was a staple on that for a number of years, and just kind of because of the way he went out, I think people aren't really seeing it as that big of a loss. But this was a premier playmaker for a number of years, so a really good player to take off that power play. And so if you guys had to pick an over under type number for Josh Morrissey next year, would you guys peg that at?
I'm gonna go over 45 points, over 50 points. I'll give it 50.
Yeah, I'll go over under 52 and a half. So
I I guess I'm the optimist here because I was thinking 60 points. I mean, I'm expecting some regression, but I think this is probably one of the better offensive defensemen in the league at this point who's really emerged. But I guess only time will tell. moving on to our last segment here, we just got a broad overview for the Winnipeg Jets offseason and upcoming season. So that offseason grade there is going to be a B. It's lower than it could have been because they failed to make a decision on Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuyck. I think those two expiring deals are going to weigh heavy over this team all season. So if they had have addressed that either with an extension or with a trade, I think this grade would be a bit higher because I really did like the return from the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. I think they got great value for that player. In terms of offensive strength, we're looking at another B. That's just because the first two lines are pretty solid, but I don't think the depth is really there to compete with some of the better offensive teams in the NHL. The defense is going to be a B as well. Again, kind of solid defense that doesn't really stick out off of the page to you, but is going to get the job done more often than not. And then in net, it's going to be an A plus. I think that Brossoit proved himself as a 1B, quite honestly, in the NHL in Vegas. And I think Connor Hellebuyck, is a top five goalie in the NHL right now. And then for the future outlook, we're looking at another B. I think there's kind of a lack of young, exciting players in the lineup, but some of those young prospects like Colby Barlow and Brad Lambert, I think are going to make a really big impact fairly soon for this Winnipeg Jets team.
The Jets lost some overall star power in the offseason with Pierre-Luc Dubois and Blake Wheeler, but they did gain some depth in their forward core. With that being said, we still don't see it pushing them over the hump. We have them fifth in our projected Western Conference standings. It really depends how they start the year, what they decide to do, because we could see them making the playoffs. Like fifth is nothing to laugh at. It's still that's just missing the wild card spot. But we'll see the fate of this team, the fate of the pending contracts that they have to deal with.
Yeah, and once they do make that decision, that'll definitely change the standing. If they decide
Yeah.
to sell everybody, they're going to plummet through the standings and try to find that high pick. So you can see them definitely lower than fifth in the wild card race. But if they do go for it, this is a team that might be able to make the playoffs.
Huge variance with this team.
Mhm.
I think is the point here. I totally agree. Team that could sneak in the playoffs or bottom out. So, with that said, we're going to move on to a new graphic for today. We've added to kind of summarize our individual rankings a bit better. So, in terms of our individual rankings, Nick had them 21st, Noel had them 19th, I had them 24th. None of us had them making a playoffs for an aggregate ranking of 22nd in the NHL, and not grabbing a playoff spot there. As you can see, our league-wide standings there on the right side. Winnipeg is 22nd above all the other teams we've already talked about. So thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you guys are enjoying these videos as much as we are. Appreciate all the support. So make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.